Hey everyone, welcome to this MTZ Insiders exclusive video on the economic forecast for 2020 and beyond. So I was getting a lot of questions from the coronavirus video that I did in terms of what does it look like economically here this year. So in this video, we're going to talk about what it looks like in 2020 for the economic outlook, and then also the surrounding years as well, because it is very important to look at the much larger cycles to see what's going on with that. So let's go and take a look here at the chart. Again, we are using the actual size of the constellations, which is different from mainstream astrology. If you are new to this, definitely check out the link on the website for more information on True Sidereal. If you're watching this from the YouTube channel, there's a link down below for more information. But an example of this is, in mainstream astrology, they say that Saturn is actually entering into the constellation of Aquarius this year. But in truth, if you look up at the visible sky, you will see Saturn entering into Capricorn. So this does change the signs. And if you are new, definitely check out those links for more information. All right, so let's take a look here at the economic look of things. The planet that we really want to turn to look for this is Saturn. So Saturn represents the bedrock of the physical structures of life, rules things like economics, political structures, governments, economic systems, right? These sort of physical bedrocks of the more physical world. And so the most important thing that we've had this year, and it is very important, is Saturn was conjunct Pluto at the beginning of the year in January. And Pluto deals with transformation. And so for those of you who've been following the channel, we were talking about in 2018 and 2019 about how there's going to be this restructuring taking place with our systems this year. And that's exactly what we've seen. So this is starting essentially a 35 to 40 year cycle with Saturn Pluto that again started around January. And the last time we saw this was back in '83. So if we look at the previous cycle, the one that we just ended since '83, we can get an idea of what the next cycle will be like, which will be for the next 35 to 40 years. So if we do look at that '83 time, that was a restructuring economically. In the 70s, there was higher interest rates. It was harder to get money. And then since the early 80s, it's been more debt-based, right? Since the 80s, there's been more about consumer debt, credit scores, having to essentially do work in order to, gain more money, which was through the debt system. And the reason it was so work-based is because Saturn and Pluto were they were conjunct in '83 in Virgo. In Virgo, the constellation deals a lot with having to do work. So it's a lot of, through your job, having to pay off your credit cards, for example, having to do all this work in order to get that debt-based money. But that's what we've seen is a lot of the, credit issuance happening in the previous cycle. So this next one that just started here in 2020 was in Sagittarius. The conjunction was in Sagittarius. And Sagittarius deals with infinite expansion. And so what I believe is that this new cycle that started this year for the next 35 to 40 years is going to be expansive. But when I say expansive, what I mean by that is economically, we're talking about inflation, essentially. I think the next 35 to 40 years is going to be a very inflationary period because of this conjunction starting in Sagittarius. So if we look at even the one prior to this, so the one prior to '83, the last time Saturn and Pluto were conjunct was also in a fire sign, which was Leo, and that was back in 1948. And so we can see that going into the 50s, there was a lot more of that kind of inflationary energy, which was about consumerism, spending money, that kind of a thing. And so this new one I think is going to be similarly, but I think it will literally deal with more expansion, which could be very inflationary, which could mean that the prices of everything goes up, including investments like the stock market, things like that. I do see that this next larger cycle will be increasing the prices of everything, including stocks, real estate, but also goods and services. So this isn't always, for those of you who know economics, inflation is not necessarily a good thing. If we look at countries like Venezuela, for example, or in our history during inflationary periods, although the price of like the stock market, for example, can go up, if you're making, let's say an extra $100 a month, so your income goes up, but then it costs an extra $10 to buy a loaf of bread. Obviously, that's not very beneficial. So just because it's an inflationary period that we're entering into doesn't mean necessarily grounded in constructive expansion. It more than likely is going to be inflationary. And that's what we're already seeing this year. We're seeing a lot of printing of money. I do expect that to continue. We're seeing this sort of, free money, easy money. So people talking about universal income, for example. So that's what I see happening during this new cycle with Saturn and Pluto. So let's go and take a look here at this year, though, specifically for a more shorter term look at what are the shifts and changes happening with, let's say, some of the shutdowns that we've seen with businesses. So that's obviously, put a halt on a lot of the economic output of things. And when I see these things starting to change is probably quite soon, actually, probably around mid-May. So this is being recorded. This video is being recorded on May 1st, by the way. So that's the information I'm dealing with in the world. But so if you are watching this video later, do keep that in mind. But what I see is starting around mid-May, May 12th, Saturn goes retrograde. And I think that's going to lift off a lot of the restrictions because, again, Saturn does deal with limitation. It's the more grounded elements of life, especially in Capricorn, where he's at when he goes retrograde. So he'll go retrograde. Pluto's already retrograde by the time of this video. Jupiter will go retrograde on May 16th, also mid-year. And we do then have the fast-moving planets going retrograde. So lots of retrogrades coming up. Venus will go retrograde May 13th. And that's going to be in a very economic-based constellation, which is Taurus. Taurus is essentially about resources and finance. So Venus will be retrograde from May 13th until June 24th. I think what's probably going to happen is there's going to be, opening, less restrictions, but also an experimentation, right? Because retrogrades definitely deal with experimentation. And so we could be opening businesses, but then there's these new policies. Maybe they have to operate in a certain way, or, opening any economy obviously is going to have a period where it's going through a reworking process. So that's what I see through the months of May through June, because after Venus goes, during Venus's retrograde, but towards the end of it, Mercury will go retrograde in Gemini. And that's going to be on June 13th, I believe. Let me just double check. June 17th. June 17th, Mercury will go retrograde in the constellation of Gemini. And Gemini is very economic based because Gemini deals with commerce and trade. And so again, we can see that kind of reworking process. And that's going to take us all the way into late June when we have the total solar eclipse, which will be on June 21st. And this eclipse will be in between both very economic constellations of Gemini dealing with trade and Taurus dealing with finance. So new beginnings, that's what I definitely see by this summertime of the Northern Hemisphere. There's going to be this new beginning, shifting from a lot of the stuff we've seen earlier this year, probably things starting to move forward economically. Do give it some time, of course. Like I said, there's going to be a lot of reworking during that time because there'll be a lot of retrogrades, but especially once we get into like the late July time and onwards, a lot of the reworking and experimentation of that opening of businesses or that new economic beginning will start to move forward. And that's going to probably take us into the rest of 2020 with whatever new is starting to arise around that summertime for the Northern Hemisphere. All right, so that's the more short-term thing. I do want to mention Mars is also going to go retrograde. He's going to go retrograde on September 10th until November 13th, but I don't think it's going to play that big of a role economically speaking, because Mars doesn't necessarily point towards that, but it will be in Pisces. And Pisces does deal with uncertainty, though, and ideals and dreams. And I think collectively, probably between mid-September to mid-November, we will probably become quite idealistic, collectively speaking. This will be approaching the elections in the U.S. as well. So there could be some uncertainty, definitely, during Mars's transit of Pisces, which will basically be that whole fall time. because even before his retrograde, he'll be in Pisces. So just good to, in our personal lives, see if there are any dreams or ideals we do want to take action towards and do that. But collectively, having faith, trust in the divine process, finding more peace in our life, things like that. But again, I don't think that's going to be too big economically speaking. And then around this time, in late September, the outer planets will start to go direct. So Saturn will go direct on September 28th. So things might start to shift there with whatever was being reopened or starting anew around that June, July time. And so we may start to see maybe more policies, again, more implementation from governments. Saturn, planet of government systems and structure, starts to move forward again. And that could be some new things being built for the economic outlook. But going into the winter time for the Northern Hemisphere, it's going to be another very important time astrologically, because we do have a total solar eclipse, which will be on December 14th. December 14th, we will have the total solar eclipse, which will be in the constellation of Ophiuchus. So what I see this is about is that this is more about the medical side of things, probably. So for example, with the coronavirus, this could be when we start to see more implementation of things like potentially vaccines, maybe medical treatments, maybe a whole new economic or let's say political policies coming out regarding medicine is certainly the case. And this would make sense too, because if we look at the coronavirus, for example, it does seem very seasonal. And so if we do come into this sort of winter time for the Northern Hemisphere, this could mean the ramping up of preparations for the virus and potentially new policies that deal with the medical industry or deal with businesses in a way that incorporates the maybe virus in that sense, to try to prevent it, so to speak. So that's the total solar eclipse, December 14th in healing Ophiuchus. And then on December 21st, we then have the conjunction with Saturn and Jupiter. And both of these planets will then go into Capricorn. So lots of shifts and changes with the outer planets this year. With this one, so Saturn and Jupiter is a 20-year cycle. And the last time we had this was back in the year 2000. And we did see that was the top of the dot-com bubble. And since then, there was also, to correct that bubble, there was a lot of printing of money or easier money. And that's what, again, I do see continuing. Now, even though that was the top of that bubble, like I said, I think we're probably going to continue to see more upside to things like the stock market because of this more Sagittarius inflationary expansion kind of energy. All right, so that's the forecast for 2020 with the important astrological events. There's one more thing I do want to look at collectively for the big picture, and that is involving the planet of Uranus, because Uranus has been in Aries for about the past couple years, and so since then we've seen a lot of sort of protests and movements towards more independence and change. And I do see that continuing throughout the rest of the year with Uranus in Aries, because Uranus, deals with revolution, change. Aries is about taking action, assertiveness, independence, right? So I do see that happening. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because next year, it's a lot to look at here with this, but if you just look here at this Saturn squaring Uranus, these red X's over here, which is in 2021, we can see that Saturn, again, dealing with governments and structures, is in a square up to Uranus, which deals with revolution and change. So I think around February of 2021 onwards, we could see some, more radical type of energy where individuals maybe are challenging the governments more. There's more restrictions on individuals and there's backlash. So there is more of that clash between freedom and limitation coming out from around February onwards of next year. So we'll see how that pans out, but that could again affect things economically, but just generally a good time of seeing how we can in our personal lives have balance between freedom and limitation, but collectively we could see a bit of a clash there with some of that. Now, the largest picture, since Uranus is going to be in Aries, so I do foresee more of this radical need for change and freedom lasting throughout the whole transit. Uranus will be in Aries up until 2024. And that leads to a very important time because 2024, we do have a lot of shifts taking place with the outer planets. One is Uranus finishing Aries, going into Taurus, which again is a very financial constellation dealing with resources and money. And so I think around that time, maybe we'll get a glimpse of it in 2023, but I think 2024 onwards, we could start to see more technological or innovative things coming into the financial sphere. And so, for example, this could be maybe cryptocurrencies gaining more widespread adoption. It could be governments start to use more technological types of currencies or something like this. But usually Uranus and Taurus can symbolize more of that innovative stuff or technological stuff that deals with finances and resources. And this will mean Uranus will be leaving Aries. So there could be something finalizing with that fiery revolutionary side that we've been seeing lately collectively. Last time Uranus finished Aries was back in, 1934. 1934. And so in this case, that did lead to the eventual World War II. I don't see this as necessarily creating a war type of situation, but just as a bit of a forecast, something to keep an eye out for is that when a planet does finish a constellation, it can sometimes mean the full activation of it. And since Aries does deal with war and action and independence, it could mean maybe something, sort of coming out from that. It could be revolutions, it could be maybe war. It doesn't necessarily mean any of those things necessarily, but something like that starting to come out that's more active or action oriented with Uranus leaving Aries more than likely. Hopefully it's not war. Again, I'm not predicting that there's going to be one, but just something to be aware of in terms of cycles. Now, also in 2024, we do have Pluto going into Capricorn, which does very much deal with restructuring. So if we take this year when Saturn and Jupiter got together, Saturn and Pluto got together, that's the restructuring that we've seen taking place. That's what I see happening in a much larger sense 2024 onwards, is when Pluto goes into Saturn's sign of Capricorn, we could start to see a lot of restructuring with systems and structures at that time. And that's going to be a very long transit. Pluto's a very slow moving planet. Pluto will be there from 2024 all the way until about 2041. 2041. And so there could be some, lots of changes there. So that's going to be the next major shifts and changes economically. I think this year was one, like we said, with the restructuring Saturn-Pluto, 35 to 40 year cycle, probably dealing more with the inflationary expansive energies of Sagittarius. And then 2024 with Uranus leaving Aries going into Taurus, maybe some innovative changes, some revolutionary energy with finance, but then also at the same time restructuring with governments, political systems, economic systems, probably going through quite the restructuring process at that time as well. All right, so everyone, I hope this gave some perspective in terms of my view, at least, of the astrological events using the actual constellations. I'd love to hear your view. So if you're on the website, if you click on the video on the bottom right, whichever that is for you, you'll see the YouTube symbol. If you want to click that, it'll take you to the YouTube page, and there you can leave some comments. I'd love to hear what you guys see in terms of your own personal forecasts, what you see in terms of where these planets are placed now, what it means for 2020, and then we can look at other people's comments and maybe piece together some ideas about what these placements actually mean. But thank you so much for your support, and I'll see you all in the next MTZ Insiders video. Take care.